Show. I'm joined by my co host, Don Weeks, who's the president of the Indoor Environmental Quality Global Alliance. And I'm Bob Krell, the publisher of Healthy Indoors magazine. Thanks so very much for joining us. Hey, Don, how are things in Ottawa today?
Good, Bob. How are you down there in Syracuse? Everything going well?
Yeah, except for the snow. It's the snow is we're in that time of year. We go from summer to winter. We have two seasons.
Absolutely, yeah. We have a shorter summer than you do, so I don't think I can take your complaint too seriously.
Which is depressing, actually, that yours is worse than ours because ours is not very good. I mean,
That's such is life. Such is life.
yeah. So can't complain. So anyway, we have a great show today. I'm real excited about our two guests. I'll let you take it away with the. Oh, actually, before you take it away with the introductions, I want to mention that this show, in the Indoor Environment Show, is a joint venture production from ISIAC, the International Society of Indoor Air Quality and Climate, and the Indoor Environmental Quality Global Alliance. They got together and partnered with us with Healthy Indoors to bring you the show. So we're really excited to have you, whether you're watching us live today or watching the recording after the fact. Just so you know, those of you in the live audience, you will have the ability to get into our live chat on the Healthy Indoors Global community, and you can pose questions, which we can pose to our guests. So, welcome those questions, and look forward to a great show.
Great, great. So our two guests today. First one is Dr. Karen Denna, who is an associate professor at the Ohio State University in Civil, Environmental, and Geodetic Engineering at the College of Engineering, and she's also in the Environmental Health Sciences area as well at the College of Public Health. Dr. Dennemeyer has a PhD, an MPhil, and an MS in Chemical and in Environmental Engineering from Yale University. So welcome to Karen. And our second guest is Dr. Brandon Boer, who is an assistant professor at Purdue University of Civil Engineering and Environmental and Ecological Engineering. He has a PhD in civil engineering from the University of Texas at Austin and an MSE in environmental and water resources engineering from the University of Texas at Austin. And today's topic is indoor exposures to chemicals and microbes from dust. So welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Hello.
Yes. Hello. So if I'm going to throw the questions to first one to Karen. Um, I noted that as I mentioned in the intro, your primary education was in chemical and environmental engineering from Yale University. How did you become interested in microbial growth and volatile organic compounds emissions from carpet and drywall under elevated relative humidity conditions, which is the title of one of your most recent papers? How did you get interested in that?
That's a great question. So when I started out in my academic career, I really fell in love with chemistry and was really interested, and I really enjoyed the classes. And the other thing that I was really interested in was learning more about the indoor environment. It's something that I just thought about a lot. We spend so much of our time indoors, about 90% in the developed world. And so I was always thinking about what we were being exposed to in our indoor environment and how that could potentially impact our health. When I went to the PhD program at Yale University, I worked under Dr. Jordan Peccia, and he had an environmental microbiology lab. And so I added this microbiology component. And so I was, of course, naturally interested in this intersection of microbes and chemicals in the indoor environment and the interactions that they might be having there. I think that those interactions have really important implications for our health, both for exposure to the microbes and exposures to the chemicals themselves, and is a really interesting area to study in research. When I came here to Ohio State University, I was really excited to be able to have a joint appointment in engineering and public health, as you mentioned. And my research right now focuses both on the engineering side, kind of fundamentally what's going on in our indoor environment, how those chemicals and microbes are interacting with our indoor environment, and then also on the health side, how does that affect health, particularly related to childhood asthma?
Great. So you mentioned childhood asthma, and we'll get back to that question. But let me bring in Brandon now. And your education is in civil engineering from the University of Texas at Austin, as well as you were a mechanical engineering undergraduate from Yale University of Pennsylvania. How did you become involved in aerosol and interested in aerosol science, indoor air physics, chemistry, building and ventilation, and so forth? Was it as at NIST as a co-op student in the IEQ ventilation group that piqued your interest, or was there other things that also helped you to develop an interest in this area?
Yeah, so when I was an undergraduate student, we had a co-op program at my college, and we had to complete 3 semesters of work in industry or at a research institute. So I had the opportunity to work at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, which is in Gaithersburg, Maryland, not too far from where I grew up in Columbia, Maryland. And I worked there for 2 full semesters, working with Andy Pursley, Steve Emmerich, and Cindy Howard-Reed in the indoor air quality and ventilation group. So that really got me interested in research on indoor air quality, human exposure to indoor air pollutants. I really enjoyed working at NIST. They have really strong focus on experimental research. I helped out with chamber measurements and field measurements in a test house, and I really enjoyed it. And I remember that my closest mentor there was Cindy Howard-Reed, and she had graduated from the University of Texas at Austin. She worked with Richard Corsi, and I spoke with her about graduate school, and she told me a lot about UT Austin, and I went to visit there, and they had a very strong program on indoor environmental science and engineering. So I ended up going there after I completed my undergraduate studies.
Well, there are a lot of very interesting and familiar names among those list of individuals. I've worked with Andy and with Rich on a number of different items, so I'm familiar with them. And Dr. Pescia was, as I mentioned to you, was at Yale and Connecticut. We certainly recognized what he was doing. So, Bob, you had a question?
No, I was just gonna say I'm pretty familiar with NIST because I'm currently I've been working there for 27 years doing indoor environmental projects for them for their campus. So I just left the campus last night. So
Okay.
spend a lot of time there. Pretty much know every square inch of it.
So, Karen, could you tell us a little bit about your research about fungal and bacterial growth in floor dust at elevated relative humidity levels?
Absolutely. So, in our research group, we focus a lot on dust in the indoor environment. And we focus on dust for 2 reasons. One is it's a really important source of human exposure. Anytime you walk into a room, you're going to resuspend dust off the floor and get exposed to whatever else was in that dust as it enters the air. The other reason is that it's this nice composite matrix of all the things that were in that environment in the recent past, the chemicals and microbes that were present there. And so by measuring what was in the dust, we can get this nice sort of comprehensive picture of what exposures might have occurred. So we became really interested in understanding how microbial growth might occur in the dust itself. A lot of people think about the indoor environment as this very dry place, the microbes are non-living, and we wanted to kind of challenge that assumption and say, hey, if you have sufficient moisture, you can likely have microbial growth that's going to occur potentially actually in that dust. So we did some experiments where we got carpet and dust from a matched home, and we brought them back to the lab and incubated them at different relative humidity levels to see what would happen with the microbial growth. And indeed, we did see microbial growth starting around 80% relative humidity within our chambers in the dust itself, and the amount of growth only increased as the relative humidity increased. So we were able to actually show that relative humidity in the air is actually sufficient to support microbial growth in dust in the indoor environment. We've taken this a couple steps further since then. We've looked at variations in relative humidity, so just short bursts repeated over time, and we showed that that can also potentially support microbial growth in dust. So for instance, an example might be showering events, where someone's repeatedly showering every day and the relative humidity gets high. That could potentially support that growth if your relative humidity by the dust is getting above that 80% growth threshold. And we've also looked a lot at microbial function. So now what are the microbes actually doing in the dust now that we know that their growth can actually potentially be supported? The relative humidity levels we were working at are pretty high for an indoor environment. The US EPA recommends that your relative humidity be between 30 and 50% and definitely below 60%. And I think that's a really solid recommendation. We know that the relative humidity in the center of a room is going to be different potentially from what's on the walls or the floors, depending on temperature differences and other factors. So if you're keeping your relative humidity below that 50 to 60% level, you should be staying far enough away from that 80% growth threshold to prevent that growth. But yeah, so we've always been really interested in dust.
I mean, do you have to, as far as that relative humidity of 80%, did your studies find that it had to be sustained at that level for a prolonged period, or could that be for short durations, short excursions actually trigger active growth?
So we did a study where we actually wanted to model that growth under short durations of elevated relative humidity. So we went down to about 6 hours. And the reason for that is other studies have shown that if you have something like a showering event occur, your relative humidity in the center of the room might go up and down, but often at the surfaces, it can remain elevated above that 80% threshold for about 6 hours. And so if you are getting those sustained levels of relative humidity on the multiple hour time frame that is repeated, it can actually support that growth in dust. It's just slower than it would be if you were sitting at a constant high relative humidity level.
So, Karen, does it make a difference as to what is the composition of the dust, whether or not you get microbial growth?
That's a great question. We've looked a lot at dust composition. Dust is very different. If you receive different dusts from people from these different studies, it can be different. Some dust is more linty, some dust is more sandy, and that can potentially make a difference in terms of the water availability, the moisture availability to the microbes. And that's something that we're actively looking into now. However, across the board, the vast majority of dust that we've looked at have had sufficient nutrients to support that microbial growth. And that's going to come from a variety of sources in the indoor environment. You know, dead skin cells, the Cheetos you dropped on the floor the other night, whatever it is going to get mixed into that dust. And so it's really the moisture that's the limiting factor for this growth because you're going to have the nutrients available.
Great, thank you. Brandon, you have been doing a lot of research on dust resuspension, the influencing factors associated with dust resuspension and the implications for human health. Could you tell us a little bit about your research in that area?
Yep. So as Karen mentioned, as we move around in a room, we're resuspending dust, and what that means is that we're releasing particles that are accumulating on surfaces, whether that's the floor, a carpeted flooring, hard flooring, a mattress, furniture, clothing. We're releasing those particles into the air, and this is something that is largely driven by human activity and human movement. So we're moving around. We walk in our homes. We walk in classrooms. We move around on a mattress or a couch. And when we engage these surfaces, we create a disturbance that can detach these very small dust particles from that surface and then release it into the air. So this is something that I've been very interested in because of all the stuff that's in the dust. As Karen alluded to, we have the biological content as well as chemicals in dust. So we're very much interested in how resuspension can contribute to our exposures to particulate matter in the indoor environment. So one thing that I have focused on is looking at how young infants can resuspend dust as they crawl. So there's been some research looking at how adults resuspend dust as they walk, but the crawling motion is quite a bit different and unique to infants, especially in the first year of life. And we know at that point in their life, they're very susceptible to the health effects associated with the exposure to the biological and chemical content of house dust. So we created a small, simplified mechanical crawling infant and conducted chamber experiments where we looked at how this crawling motion can release different sized particles into the breathing zone of the infant. And one thing that is very unique about young infants is that they're very close to the floor over which they're crawling. And that proximity can then enhance their exposure to the particles that they are resuspending from the carpet or any other surface that they're encountering.
Yeah, and of course, their infants would have a higher respiratory rate in their body mass. There's all those factors, right, that make them more susceptible potentially to stuff that's picked off and aerosolized dust.
Yeah, that's one of the things that we looked at is the dose that's received by the respiratory system of an infant versus an adult when they are actively resuspending particles and then inhaling those particles into their lung. And so what we found is that there are differences in terms of the dose received by an infant versus an adult, partially because of the tendency for infants to breathe through their mouth and their nose, as opposed to an adult that primarily breathes through their nose. So that can strongly impact where these particles end up in the respiratory system. And we found that when the infant is crawling, a lot of these particles, which are mostly below 10 micrometers in size, could get to the deepest regions of their respiratory system, so the tracheal, bronchial, and pulmonary regions of the respiratory system. And then when you normalize the dose that they receive in their respiratory system by their body mass, it's much greater than what an adult would receive.
So, Brandon, did you see much of a difference between the surfaces that the infant was crawling on? Was there higher problems or issues with carpet versus, say, a plain wood floor?
So in our study, we only looked at carpeted flooring. In this case, it was actually rugs that we brought into the lab. So we did not look at hard flooring. But what we found is that since we took these rugs from the homes of families, there's quite wide variation in the concentrations of the particles that resuspended from the carpet. So I think that kind of goes to the characteristics of these dust deposits that form on surfaces. And there's a wide variation in how much dust can accumulate on a surface, the size distribution of these dust particles on a surface, the nature of the fibers of the carpet. And what we found is that there is a pretty wide variation just among carpet in terms of what the infant would be exposed to. In terms of comparing carpet with hard flooring like wood or linoleum, Andrea Farrow at Clarkson University has done a lot of research looking into that. And there are certainly variations between the surfaces and how those surfaces are treated, the nature of the carpet fibers, the humidity conditions that exist, and so forth.
Great. So, Karen, more of a general question, but perhaps you could give us some insight into what should homeowners and indoor environmental quality practitioners know about carpet, especially those that are wetted?
That's a great question. So we were really excited in the summer of 2019 to host a carpet workshop here on Ohio State University's campus. This was sponsored by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, and we were able to bring about 40 people together to look at questions about what it means to have a carpet in your indoor space. We were really excited that Brandon could come. We also had people from a variety of academic disciplines, from carpet, and we also had carpet manufacturers. The carpet cleaning industry was represented. We had several different government agencies as well as some nonprofit groups. And everybody was able to come together and talk about what it means to have a carpet in your indoor space. So we published a final report from the workshop that you can access. It's open access now in the journal Building and Environment. 10 questions about the impacts of carpet on indoor microbiology and indoor chemistry. So take a look if you have the opportunity. But we had some really interesting findings from this workshop. The first is that carpet really acts as this reservoir in the indoor environment. And I might let Brandon talk a little bit more detail on that, but it's really both a source and a sink for just microbes and chemicals and other things that might be in your indoor environment, where it's going to both sort of hold on to those and also release them when somebody walks over that carpet and resuspends it into the air. The carpets themselves can also be a direct emitter of chemicals and also support different chemical transformations that might be occurring in the indoor environment. So it can change not only the indoor microbiology, but also the indoor chemistry of what's occurring in an individual indoor environment. We also talked about sustainability concerns with carpet, and this needs to include both the maintenance, disposal, and replacement. So it's important that we think about sustainability when we have carpets in our indoor space. And finally, we talked about the future of carpets. And one of the great things that came out was that we could really start to think about carpets as in terms of the implications for indoor environmental quality. That when we think about designing carpets, we should be thinking about the impacts on indoor environmental quality. Number one, where we want to put them. Number two, how are we going to maintain them when we put them there? And three, can we design them in a better way to better support indoor environmental quality concerns?
I mean, are there major takeaways from what you from that symposium or that meeting that you had? Obviously, there's the building stock in America. There's a lot of carpet, right? I mean, this carpet, and we see, obviously in residences, very common. Schools, especially primary schools, have a tendency to have carpeting Again, we're student spaces and kindergartens, and in that realm, office environments. I mean, it's everywhere. I mean, there is carpeting. The soft surface environments. Are there any major takeaways as far as I hate to put you on the spot here, but is it like good or bad? I mean, how, is carpet conducive to a good indoor quality in an environment? Or can it
You're
be?
absolutely right. So carpet makes up about 50% of the U.S. flooring market right now, and there are some big takeaways. The first one is that I think we need to be a little more cognizant of where we put carpet. Um, it doesn't mean you can't use carpet. Carpet has a lot of beneficial qualities. It's why we use it. There's injury prevention, slip resistance. It has sound dampening properties. There are reasons that you might want to have a carpet. I think we need to just think carefully about where we put carpets. We don't want to put a carpet anywhere that's going to get damp or wet. So if you have an environment such as like a bathroom floor or possibly like a basement concrete floor that is going to get wet, that is a really poor place to put a carpet in terms of indoor environmental quality concerns. And you also want to think about who's going to be in your environment. Do you have anybody there who's especially sensitive to the resuspension of dust that you might potentially be concerned about? Finally, we also want to make sure that when we put carpet somewhere, we can properly maintain it so that it's being cleaned on a regular basis, and we're also making sure that it's not getting wet and you're not having these issues. So I think we just need to think carefully about where we put carpets in our space.
I mean, the maintenance is a big issue, though, right? I mean, clearly.
Yeah, and so I think that if you purchase a carpet and put it in a space, you just need to be committed to doing the proper maintenance for it. There are some really great findings from the carpet workshop regarding resuspension as well. And Brandon did a lot of work putting that together on the paper, so I'll let him talk a little bit about those too.
Go ahead, Brendan.
Thank you, Karen. So this is a very nice study that was led by Karen, and we were able to come together and outline what we know about particle resuspension and what we don't know. So what are the knowledge gaps? So I worked on a section on particle resuspension with Andrea Farrow and others, and we were able to summarize, what are the key factors affecting particle resuspension, and those include how big are these dust particles. So that's a very strong governing factor affecting particle transport in the indoor environment. So at least for particles above about 1 micrometer in size, the larger the particle, the more likely it is to resuspend from a surface. We also know factors like relative humidity affect resuspension, and at high relative humidity, you can enhance the adhesion between the particle and the surface, which can then result in lower resuspension. We also know that properties of the carpet affect resuspension, and factors regarding human movement. So if we're walking across the carpet, do we have shoes on? Are we walking in our bare feet? What is our step frequency as we walk across the carpet? Are we walking slowly versus fast? Are we moving in terms of walking versus crawling? Those are important factors. And I think that one thing that has not been investigated so much has been the implications of resuspension to the exposure to all the stuff that's in the carpet. So I think that we're starting to realize that resuspension is very important, is a primary delivery mechanism for the stuff in the dust to the air, to our breathing zones. So this could be a significant factor affecting, especially for infants, how much particle-bound semi-volatile organic compounds they're exposed to, bacteria and fungi in the carpet, and other agents.
So to the both of you, does it make a difference as to the type of carpeting composition? In other words, people may say, well, maybe there's less of an issue, for example, with natural fibers versus manufactured fibers. In your studies, your research, has that been proven or shown one way or the other, whether or not there's, that has an effect on the resuspension of particles? I'll let either one of you take that.
So in some of our work, we've looked at fiber composition, specifically related to microbial growth under elevated relative humidity conditions. The interesting thing was we found out in our study that moisture was really the dominating factor in terms of if the carpet material is going to support that growth. It's really all about the moisture. That was the number one factor. The second factor determining how much microbial growth you'd get under a specific set of environmental conditions is the amount of dust present. However, the amount, you don't really need that much dust to support the growth. Generally, you're going to have sufficient dust unless, say, it's a brand new carpet that nobody's really walked on yet. And the third factor was fiber composition, and we did see some small differences with fiber type, but those differences were pretty small relative to the moisture considerations and the nutrient availability in terms of if you have damp conditions and the potential to support that growth. There are also some differences about carpet types, such as looped carpet fibers versus cut pile that can affect resuspension. And I'll let Brandon take that part of the question.
Yeah, so there's certainly differences in the amount of resuspension that occurs from different types of carpet, and this has been investigated in various chamber studies. So we know that there could be enhanced resuspension from carpet compared to hard flooring. I think one thing that we need to think about is not only the differences between the different surface types, but how much dust is present on that surface. So I think with carpet, you may have the tendency to trap particles more strongly than you would with hard flooring. So you could have dust that kind of gets very deeply embedded in the carpet fibers and remain there for long periods of time. So what we have seen is that there's typically greater amounts of dust on a carpeted floor versus a hard floor, because I think it's able to trap those particles better and maybe a little bit more difficult to clean. And because of that, since there's more dust, the emission rate that you would have of these particles as they're resuspended can be greater than you would with a hard flooring. And I think also related to resuspension and floor type is cleaning and the efficiency of the cleaning for that particular surface. So that's one thing that we looked at least with carpeted flooring, that if you were to vacuum the carpet, generally that does a good job at removing the dust, reducing the amount of dust that's present, which then ultimately reduces the concentrations of the resuspended particles that one would be exposed to. But what we found is that for some carpets, the vacuuming process can actually increase your exposure to particles. And this could be because the vacuuming process itself is agitating particles that are very deeply embedded in the carpet fibers, perhaps breaking apart larger agglomerates of dust, and perhaps also bringing some of this dust that's very deep in the carpet fiber matrix upwards towards the surface, where it becomes more readily available for resuspension. So I think there's some aspects about how we clean surfaces that need to be factored in regard to looking at particle resuspension and how we can reduce it. But I think the best thing is to minimize accumulation of dust on surfaces through frequent cleaning as best possible in a particular environment.
Well, you're both using the term dust, and that's our whole conversation here. But is it safe to point out that all dust is not created equal? Obviously, there's the nature could vary quite a bit, right? We're not talking about dust in a homogeneous type particulate, right? And what have you done to actually, in your various studies and your various exploration on this, are you seeing different types of composition of dust in different types of environments, and how much of a variance, and how, it seems like there's a lot of factors there, right? A lot of variables.
Yeah, you can have a wide range of different dust. Depends where you've collected the dust from. We've collected dust from some more commercial environments, and it can be more soil type sandy material that everybody was tracking in from outside. You can have more of the linty type dust, and the microbial composition of the dust can be quite different as well. There's going to be a lot of factors that influence that. It can be geographic location, as well as building use, ventilation effects, the occupancy levels, including pets, if you have dogs or cats. All of those factors can influence dust in different environments.
So looking at it from the homeowner's viewpoint or from the practitioner's viewpoint, what would you recommend, or is there a good recommendation at this point as to what can be done for cleaning? What should an average individual homeowner be doing in terms of cleaning? We recognize the frequency, but what type of cleaning is probably preferred to help to control the amount of dust that's in the carpet?
I think frequent vacuuming of carpet is certainly a good idea. I think that, that's up to the homeowner and the family. How often are they cleaning their floor? What type of vacuum cleaner they have, the suction pressure of that vacuum cleaner, and how long are they cleaning the carpet. But I think that the more frequently you clean the carpet, you're going to reduce the amount of dust that's present, and therefore the amount of dust that may resuspend in the future. So I think that's certainly something that can be done. I think also related to sources of dust, tracking, as Karen mentioned, our shoes, we carry a lot of dust on the bottom of our shoes. I think in the United States, it's rather common to keep our shoes on inside our homes. And that's not that great in terms of contributing to the accumulation of dust, because we're bringing in stuff from outside and from other indoor environments into our home. So, if you remove your shoes at the entry door, then I think you have the potential to significantly minimize tracking. So that's one source of dust that can be eliminated. And another source of dust on surfaces is particle deposition to those surfaces. So one thing you can do there is try to reduce airborne concentrations of particles, try to eliminate these particles before they can deposit and accumulate on surfaces. And that can be done through a variety of techniques, such as portable air filtration, improved filtration in a residential HVAC system, improved ventilation, source control in the home, things like that.
Brendan, as far as the resuspension in your research, is the biggest contributing factor just foot traffic in the indoor environments for suspending particles, as opposed to maybe the mechanical systems or other human activities other than just actual movement in the space?
Yeah, I would say in the occupied space itself, it's going to be human movement and maybe also the movement of pets. And that's something that really hasn't been investigated. So cats and dogs are obviously moving around, and they may also resuspend particles, but it's really movement induced in the occupied space. In HVAC systems, we can also have particle resuspension. There could be the accumulation of dust on the surfaces of ventilation ducts. And with the dynamic and transient operation of an HVAC system, you can create very impulsive airflow that can detach these particles. So if this dust is accumulating, let's say downstream of the HVAC filter, the HVAC system turns on in a residential environment, you have kind of strong gusts of air that flows over that surface, and that can resuspend particles. In one study I did very early on as a graduate student, we looked at dust loading in ventilation ducts or on ventilation ducts, and it can be quite high, especially in homes where you don't, let's say, have your ducts cleaned frequently. And if you have a low quality HVAC filter, those particles are getting through the filter. They can deposit and accumulate on the surfaces of ventilation ducts and other HVAC components, and then be re-released into the air. And I think with HVAC systems, especially near a cooling coil, you could have regions of high relative humidity that could promote microbial growth, as Karen has studied, and perhaps that's something that's of concern.
Yeah, what's interesting, I think, a follow up to that, if we're talking in terms of residential systems, most of the HVAC systems that are residential, at least in place in the building stock, are not variable speed drive fans, right? These are fans that are on off, so there is that burst that you mentioned, whereas you don't have a slow ramping up of fan operation. So I would assume that would have a lot to do with popping particulate loose from the internal ductwork and popping it out into the environment.
Yeah, I think it's this kind of impulsive nature of the airflow that can strongly affect resuspension. And this is also similar to when we walk across the floor. As our foot contacts the floor, we can generate a very high velocity air jet near the toe. And, that's as rather high velocity. The flow is accelerating very rapidly, and then that contributes to these aerodynamic removal forces that help the particles detach. And the same thing could be happening inside an HVAC system. We also know for human-induced resuspension, not only are aerodynamic forces important, but mechanical forces like abrasion, vibrations of the carpet fibers, as well as electrostatic forces. So if you're walking around the carpet in your house, you may feel like kind of that static charge, and there are electrostatic factors that can help enhance particle resuspension as well as suppress it.
So you both were a part of a team of researchers that wrote an article about the 10 questions concerning the implications of carpet on indoor chemistry and microbiology. I assume, Karen, this is from the symposium that you were talking about. I was wondering if you could kind of summarize what the 10 questions and answers were.
Are they in order, by the way? Is it the top 10, or is it just 10? Is it 10 in no particular order? I mean, are there certain ones that stand out more?
We thought really carefully about the 10 questions that we wanted to include in this paper, and really what are the major things that you want to think about. And so this is the paper that we were talking about earlier from the workshop that we held here at Ohio State. And so the questions focused on several different areas. One is kind of what is carpet. We talked about how the carpet is about 50% of the US flooring industry, where people use it. We also talked about the microbial implications, the chemical implications of carpet, a lot about the resuspension questions that Brandon has gone into in depth, and then also about sustainability issues and this kind of big question about the future of carpet. Where do we want carpet to go? What kind of design factors should we be thinking about when we focus on carpet in the future? And so a lot of that was that we can really have this kind of indoor environmental quality focus when we think about carpet design. So let's think about the type of pile we're using, like can that make a difference in resuspension rates? Questions like that.
Great. Brandon, we wanted to talk a little bit about your research that you did on the air pollution sensors, as you noted in a recent research paper. Could you give us a little bit of an idea of what type of research you're doing on those air pollution sensors?
Okay, sure. So I think this is a rather active area of research in indoor air quality community. So certainly we want to evaluate our exposure to dust resuspension in indoor environment, as well as exposure to other indoor particle sources. When we do research at a university, we can use really nice instrumentation, very accurately measure the concentration and size of particles that may be coming off the surface or from other sources. But if you're doing kind of just general home monitoring of indoor air quality, it's hard to deploy these expensive instruments. So I think one area people have moved into is the use of low cost and affordable air quality sensors for measuring various different types of air pollutants, including particles. So one thing we looked at was how to improve the performance of these low cost particle sensors. So a lot of these low cost particle sensors are based on the optical detection of particles, much like a smoke detector. Their accuracy is quite variable. Some are quite cheap, about $10. Others are a little bit more expensive, several $100s. So we deployed these low-cost particle sensors in a net zero house at Purdue called the Renew House, where it was occupied by 4 people. So we had a variety of different indoor particle sources, including dust resuspension. And then we used reference grade instrumentation to evaluate the performance of these sensors, and then came up with a strategy to improve the performance. So one thing we noticed with these low-cost sensors is that they're not super great in detecting small particles below 1 micrometer in size. So because they're based on the optical detection of particles, they're quite limited in detecting these smaller particles because they don't scatter enough light. And what we found for, let's say, the measurement of PM 2.5, which is the mass concentration of particles below 2.5 microns in size, a significant chunk of that PM 2.5 in the indoor or outdoor environment is below about 300 to 500 nanometers, or 0.3 to 0.5 micrometers. And this is kind of the lower limit for these low-cost particle sensors. So they're largely blind to these small particles that contribute meaningfully to PM 2.5 mass concentrations in the indoor environment. So we came up with a technique to predict the kind of missing particles that these sensors are not seeing. And what we found is that 50% or so of the particle mass for PM 2.5 can be below the lower detection limit of these sensors. So that's a concern in terms of accurate estimation of exposures to particles. But they're cheap, but you do need to at least calibrate them using reference grade instrumentation before they're deployed in a field environment to make sure that you're getting reliable data.
But you can do that if you're doing it from a research perspective, right? Because you're going to have that, that higher end equipment to compare it to. But for the general consumer, the residential consumer, even the commercial consumer, right, in an office environment, they're not going to have that capability. So they're buying these devices off the shelf. And I mean, do you think at times it's really they're not giving an accurate picture of what's happening in the space?
Well, I think the manufacturer of the sensors could also work on the calibration and do like batch calibrations of these sensors before they're sold to the consumer. I think one thing that is good about these sensors is that maybe they're not super accurate in measuring the concentrations and size distributions of particles in the indoor environment, but they're a good proxy for sources of particles. So if the reading goes up, probably something is happening.
So looking at trends with them,
Looking at trends. So
with the data lock. Okay.
Yep. So I think that is very helpful. So they will typically register emissions from many different sources, not all, because some sources produce very small particles that these sensors would not see. But I do think they could give a good indication of what's going on in a space, even without these kind of more robust calibration techniques.
Great, thank you. Karen, I was interested in your research on the indoor environment of spacecrafts. Perhaps you could describe a little bit what you found by your research doing that.
Absolutely. So we have been thrilled to be able to work with NASA and understand the indoor environmental quality on the International Space Station. There's a long history of trying to understand the microbial environment of these spacecraft. So for whenever you put people in this enclosed environment with essentially no ventilation, you can potentially have moisture concerns. People exhale moisture, we sweat, water is necessary for life, and so it's really important to make sure that that's under control. For instance, for the spacecraft Mir, the relative humidity levels could get quite high, and there was some fungal degradation occurring for wiring and window seals at the time of its decommissioning. I mean, you can imagine those are pretty important when you're in a spacecraft. We learned a lot of lessons when we designed the International Space Station, and now we have much better control over the relative humidity up there. But we still wanted to work with NASA to help understand what could happen if the relative humidity inadvertently did get high, and help improve predictive capabilities so we could understand what might happen if, say, there was a temporary ventilation system failure or some other circumstance where you had a short period of higher relative humidity than you wanted to have. So we were able to receive some dust from the International Space Station. It's collected on the HEPA filters up there. So the astronauts have chores to do where they'll actually vacuum the dust off the HEPA filter. And we were thrilled to be able to receive some of that dust coming down. And we took it back to the lab and incubated it under a bunch of different relative humidity conditions, just as we did from the dust from different home environments. And we were able to determine that very similar things happen from the dust from the International Space Station to what happens to your dust from the home environment if the relative humidity levels were to get too high. So we were able to show as the relative humidity increases, you do get this increase in microbial growth in the dust itself, and help determine at what levels that would occur. And it will help NASA in the future if we do have an unexpected circumstance occur, for them to understand what may have happened in their dust and help take the proper steps to remediate it.
When you're speaking of microbial, so you're looking at both fungal and bacterial constituents?
We are looking at both. The story's really all about those fungal constituents, though. It's the bacteria will grow, but you need to be almost at the point where you have condensed water to really start seeing any real bacterial growth or activity. It's really all about the fungi. They can grow starting around 80% relative humidity, as I said before. And so these relative humidity levels are already pretty high. And so you're just much more likely to be in a range where you have that fungal growth. If you're at the point where you have bacterial growth, you're in trouble.
Okay.
Like you need to clean that up. So
great, that sounds fascinating. Brandon, I was also interested on your research on ethanol-based disinfectant sprays and the changes in indoor air in residence. Perhaps you could describe what you had found by that research.
Sure. So over the past year and a half, the COVID-19 pandemic, there has been increased usage of chemical disinfectants, and these can just be, household disinfectants that you can pick up from the local grocery store, or, commercial grade disinfectants that may be used in a hospital environment. So I think there's a lot of concern about human exposure, inhalation exposure to the chemicals released from these disinfectant sprays that have been widely used during the pandemic and even before. So we conducted a study at Purdue. This was led by my colleague Nusrat Jung, and it was in collaboration with the industry partner RJ Lee Group, where we used a variety of very sensitive instrumentation to characterize the emissions and exposures from a variety of different chemical disinfectants. So we looked at disinfectants that contained ethanol, isopropyl alcohol, peracetic acid, which is more of a commercial grade disinfectant, thymol. This is a kind of a botanical disinfectant, and thymol is an essential oil of thyme, and it's been shown to be effective in inactivating human coronaviruses, as well as other active ingredients that were included in the US EPA List N. So what we did is we conducted controlled chamber experiments where we sprayed these disinfectants onto a surface and then measured the airborne concentration of volatile organic compounds in real time, as well as very small particles. And we found that these kind of very widely used ethanol-based disinfectants can rapidly transform the chemical composition of indoor air. So of course they're releasing ethanol in rather high concentrations, as well as a variety of other volatile organic compounds that are either listed on the ingredient label or not listed, depending on their actual concentration in the solution. Then we found for these ethanol-based disinfectants that with the spray process, because you have a pressurized canister, that very small ultrafine particles are produced in rather high concentrations. So we found for one product, concentrations on the order of 100,000 particles per cubic centimeter. So to put that in perspective, that's similar magnitude in terms of the concentrations of ultrafine particles you would have in a kitchen when you're cooking. So very significant generation of small particles. Some, they're evaporating and then releasing these VOCs into the air. We found that for these botanical disinfectants, which are quite prevalent today, typically sold as kind of green cleaning agents and so forth, they release a spectrum of VOCs that include monoterpenes and monoterpenoids. And these are very, they have a very pleasant smellscape. We enjoy the aroma associated with these terpenes and terpenoids, things like limonene and pinene and many others. But the issue with these particular compounds that they're included in disinfectant sprays is that they're highly reactive with indoor oxidants such as ozone. And because of that, when they react with ozone that can be delivered from the outdoor environment to the ventilation system, you can have the formation of very small particles. This is called secondary organic aerosol formation. And we found that this is occurring when you're spraying these botanical disinfectants in the indoor environment. And the concentration of these secondary organic aerosols can also be very high, similar to levels of particles that would be produced during a cooking event. So there's certainly, I think, concern about our exposure to both gas phase and particle phase species through the use of these sprays that you can pick up, at your local store. And if you're doing it in your house, you're not wearing any respiratory protection. And if it's done by custodial staff or cleaning staff in a commercial building, they may be using this stuff, quite frequently during the day, whether spraying it, wiping it, mopping with it. So the chemical exposures and particle exposures could be, significant.
Well, the subsequent chemistry seems kind of alarming, potentially, right? We've seen a lot of studies about that. And so have you found that, I mean, I think anecdotally, we know that people used a lot more of these types of products over the past 18 months, as a knee-jerk reaction to COVID, right? And so overall, I think more, actually less beneficial than people thought, right? To be introducing more of these products or new products into the space. And do you think that is now a practice that people are going to have adopted? We've done 18 months of this and everybody seems to be hyper attuned to, cleaning surfaces and antimicrobial and this whole thing. And what does that hold for us going forward? How do you see that as an issue? Do we need to message this better? I know it
Yeah,
was a long question. I apologize.
I think it's a very good question, and I think certainly there's been a lot of discussions, I think, on social media and elsewhere regarding kind of like over cleaning of indoor environments during the pandemic using, whether it's chemical disinfectants or various air cleaning devices that may not be super effective and produce byproducts that are not very good to be exposed to. So I think that's certainly something of concern. And many of these products have been used before COVID-19, whether it's for disinfection or cleaning purposes. In some environments like hospitals, this is needed. We need to have sterilization of surfaces for a variety of reasons. So I think it's of concern, increased usage of these chemicals. And I think this is kind of just a general theme with the kind of ubiquitous use of what are referred to as volatile chemical products, or VCPs. Mm-hmm. This includes disinfectants and cleaning agents, personal care products. We're using just so much of this stuff inside our homes, classrooms. It's getting into the air. It's getting into the outdoor air because we have air exchange between indoor and outdoor environments. So it's affecting outdoor air quality. I think it's something that we need to be, aware of, moving forward. Use these chemicals and the impact they have on the environment and people. Do we really need to be using them? And can we find more, less toxic alternatives?
I'd like to hear your take too, Karen, on that.
Yeah, I pretty much agree that we need to think really carefully about the pros and cons of using these chemicals and determine when it's appropriate and when it may not be. So I agree.
So Karen, I've read your recent paper about the I'm gonna mispronounce this, but I'm gonna say V. Victoriae or Cryptococcus victoriae in homes of asthmatic and non-asthmatic children in New York City. Can you tell us how this study came about and what was the conclusion of the paper?
Absolutely. I was really excited about this study. So this was a collaboration with Matt Perzanowski at Columbia University and Brett Green at NIOSH and their research groups. And this really came about sort of bouncing off a previous study we had done where we looked at early life fungal exposures and asthma development. And we found this inverse association with diversity. So the children who had higher exposure to fungal diversity early in life were less likely to develop asthma later. And this has since been repeated in multiple birth cohort studies, but it's unclear if there's a causal relationship here or what that relationship is, because diversity is kind of this non-specific measure. You just have a lot of different things. So one thing in that study that we had noted was that diversity, particularly within the genus Cryptococcus, was very strongly associated inversely with asthma as potentially being protective. So we wanted to dive into that potential association a little bit deeper. Cryptococcus yeasts have really been understudied because they've been really difficult to culture. And so a lot of the work that's been done on fungal characterization has been done on other species that are just easier to deal with in the lab. And so a lot of these Basidiomycota yeasts are just sort of understudied. And Cryptococcus since then has been renamed into several different subgroups as we get more genetic information and general information about this group. So when I refer to Cryptococcus here, I'm sort of referring to this old, very broad categorization of these yeast species. So for this study, we were able to look at exposures in the neighborhood allergy and asthma study that was done in New York City. And we look specifically here at Cryptococcus victoriae, which has since been renamed as Vishneomycosniae victoriae. I know it's a really long word. I'm really sorry. But for this particular species, we were interested because we had seen the genetic information for it in our sequencing studies as highly prevalent. So we decided to study it with qPCR primers, which are a little bit more of a gold standard in terms of how much is going to be there. So we detected this particular species in 92% of homes that were included in our analysis. And it was really interesting because we found several associations with it. It was associated with the presence of dogs in a home, for instance. It also had associations with season and relative humidity, as well as the presence of carpet and the number of occupants that were in that home. In addition, we did find associations with asthma. So we found that actually concentrations of this were lower in the homes of kids with asthma compared to those without asthma, which was really interesting. And this particular association was only seen in those students that were in those children that were non-seroatopic, so those that were not allergic, really. So this is really the tip of the iceberg here, and understanding how these yeast exposures in our environment might potentially be impacting human health, because it's really been understudied. These yeast species, prior to a lot of the new DNA-based methods that are available to measure microbes, were just usually either not measured at all or were lumped together as like yeast-like thing we saw under the microscope. So we can really dive more deeply into what's going on here. And I think that there's a lot more exciting work to be done to understand these associations.
Do you have plans to continue that? And do a bit
Yeah,
more?
absolutely. We're actively working on understanding Cryptococcus and how these early life exposures might impact asthma outcomes.
Excellent.
Great. I guess we're coming close to
We're
the
getting
end.
to that time. Yeah. So
Yeah. The last question I have for both of you is, what is it that you're working on or will be working on in the near future that we should know about? I'll start with Brendan.
Sure. So we're doing research on volatile organic compounds. That's been, I think, kind of a important focus in research on indoor chemistry. So looking at emissions of volatile organic compounds, where are they coming from, whether that's the human body, personal care products, cleaning products, disinfectants, and then the chemistry that these volatile organic compounds participate in. And one thing that we're particularly interested in is how these volatile organic compounds contribute to new particle formation in the indoor environment, so the production of secondary organic aerosol. So these can include very, very tiny particles, just a few nanometers in size. Concentrations can be very high, and these small particles do very efficiently deposit in all regions of the respiratory system. So we're very much interested in how are these particles forming, the factors that affect their formation, and then the exposure that people will have during different types of activities where these VOCs are being introduced into the indoor environment.
Great, thank you. Karen?
So one of the projects that we're working on now that I'm really excited about is we've been working on developing dust as a new monitoring matrix for COVID-19 and potentially other respiratory viral illnesses. So you can actually measure SARS-CoV-2 in dust. I want to be completely clear here. We are measuring the RNA. It's this like leftover viral fragment. It is not infection. We are not measuring viability. It's just sort of this leftover piece of the virus that can be present if someone infected with COVID-19 had been in that environment. And it turns out that you can use dust very similarly to how you can use wastewater to track COVID-19. It has some benefits to it in that it's non-invasive, just like wastewater, but you can more easily use it at the building scale, where if you're trying to use wastewater, sometimes you don't always have a good access point, and those samples can be really difficult to collect from a particular building rather than at the sewer shed level. So you can use this method to actually monitor for COVID-19 at the building scale and kind of get this higher resolution data about where you might potentially be having an outbreak or other issues that are occurring. So we are actively doing this on Ohio State's campus right now. We're monitoring all the residence halls as well as several other key public buildings as another tool in the toolbox to help in the fight against COVID-19 and keep an eye on what's going on campus and help keep everybody safe and keep everybody here.
Great.
So,
Go ahead, Bob.
I was going to say, Healthy Indoors editor Susan Valenti has been in the back end monitoring chat, but she has a question she wanted us to throw out to the both of you. Ohio State and Purdue played a great football game against each other last weekend. Any football rivalry between the two of you? I don't know how we got back to football.
It wasn't great for Purdue. That's for sure.
Ohio, yeah, it was good.
It's all relative though. It's perspective here.
Well, I think Ohio State's playing Michigan State, and then they have to play Michigan, so that's two tough games that they would have to win if they want to get into the college football playoff. Yep. I think Purdue, is not a football powerhouse like Ohio State, but has played well for the most part this season because we upset Iowa and Michigan State. And I went to the game at Michigan State, and all the students rushed onto the field. That was pretty cool.
Well, Syracuse has a football program.
Yeah, that's true.
That's as far as I can go with that.
And in
But you're known
Ottawa,
for
we have, yeah, for basketball.
But we do play some basketball. Yeah, we're a challenge there.
The stadium's right outside my window. I'm pretty close.
Oh, you're right there.
Yeah.
Big horseshoe, right?
Yep.
That thing is amazing. I was there years ago on a consulting project to some actual housing across the street from that, and it's just breathtaking to look at just the scope of that and how many people end up in that venue.
Yeah, absolutely.
On a Saturday. It's crazy. I wanted to point out before we leave here, Don, one of the things that we're involved with Healthy Indoors Magazine is the upcoming event from ISIAC. So this is the Healthy Buildings America. Healthy Buildings America 2021 will be taking place this January 18th through 20th in Honolulu, Hawaii. I know it's been postponed a bit due to the COVID issue, but this is a live conference, and the basic premise behind this is bridging the gap between research and practice. So this is a little bit of a departure from some of the previous Healthy Buildings events that ISIAC has held. The hosting organization is CIRI, the Cleaning Industry Research Institute, and we'll be there with Healthy Indoors. We'll actually be there as the live streamer of this. So we're going to be providing the live stream for the event, which we're pretty excited about. Don, you'll be there, right?
We'll see.
You don't know. Yeah, okay. Well, I mean, you'll be there virtually at the very least, right?
At the very minimum, I'll be there virtually. But yeah, so yeah, I'm looking forward to it. And I wanted to thank both of our guests today. You were terrific. Thank you very much for some really good information. And we're looking forward to seeing your future research efforts. And as I said, this particular show is sponsored by ISIAC. And we'll have another one coming in December that will be sponsored by ASHRAE. And we're looking forward to that one. I think it's December 17th, is it? I can't remember the exact date. Let me take a brief look here.
How embarrassing. It's like I can't either. So that's I was getting ready to try to come in. I thought it was the 16th, but I know
you're right. It is the 16th. It is the 16th.
We were coordinating with our guests. We have some two very interesting guests coming up for the next episode. So we're really excited to close out the year and our first run with this series for ISIAC and IEQGA. So this has been great. We thank all of you for tuning into the show, whether you're watching it live now or watching it later on. You can definitely see all the shows at the Healthy Indoors online global community. You'll be able to get access to all the past episodes, as well as on the ISIAC website. I believe they have them all there as well. So thanks again to both of you.
Thank you very much.
So much.
And happy Thanksgiving. Maybe the first to wish you that. We're getting close.
Yep, next week.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So until next time, for my co-host Don Weeks and I'm Bob Krell. Thank you very much for attending the Indoor Environments Global Research to Action Show. We'll see you next time.